Why would the people what?
Why should people not vote for Boris Johnson?
I think Boris Johnson represents, alongside the general Conservative Party leadership contestants, represents an arcane framework whereby the old English ruling classes, Charterhouse, Harrow, Eton, Oxford, Cambridge, and this sort of entourage tied to the royal family and the aristocracy, that they think they have a right, a divine right to rule. Firstly, starting through the Conservative Party and then over the whole of society. And it's quite clear in the case of Boris Johnson, he thinks, and he has thought since he was at university, or possibly since he was at Eton, that he has a right to a claim on the prime ministership, just like Prince Charles thinks he's got a right to become the King of England. And so we're dealing here with a privileged elite with historical ties to the capitalist class, the banking classes, the landowning classes, the aristocracy, who feel that they have a divine duty and right to represent the ruling class of Britain. And in fact, one of the peculiarities of this altercation that we hear about on the day... How are you, my friend? Long time. That's a long time, mate. How are you? You remember him?
Yeah.
Long time. That must be 20 years, isn't it?
Yeah, more than that.
20 years, I reckon, yeah. Any case, they believe they have this right to rule. And are they particularly brilliant at ruling? Well, a lot of people in the Conservative elite, and I read an article in the Financial Times today, and they were talking about how brilliant Boris Johnson is as a speaker, because he uses the rule of three, you know, suggest, strengthen, reinforce, you know, with some like anecdotes and jokes and comments. And the consequence of that is that the bumbling idiot that you sometimes see contrasts with the bright mind that he's got. Definitely Boris Johnson is an intelligent man, much more intelligent than he appears to be when he's speaking. And the Conservatives hope, it's not really an answer in this way because I'm not going to vote for him and you know that in the first place, so I presume the question was rhetorical. The Conservative voters believe, a section of them, that by backing the Tories, by backing, of course you need, the Conservative Party requires a layer of the working class and a layer of the middle class to back them. In other words, it requires that the section of the population who have an antagonistic interest to the Conservative Party votes for them. So how do you get people who you're basically going to shaft? How do you get people who you're going to shaft to vote for you? This has always been the dilemma of conservatism. After all, the Conservative Party has been around for hundreds of years, which means it's been around for hundreds of years before the people had the right to vote. So in other words, it's a party of privilege, a party of power, a party of interests that control the society before the population had the right to veto that decision. So it means that those who vote for them must believe that the Conservatives somehow are their betters, their superiors, have some innate capacity over and above what the population itself has. That they know better than you or I. That they're cleverer, smarter, more capable. They know how to run things. That, of course, is the trait of serfs, of servants, of scullery cleaners, upstairs, downstairs. You're the downstairs, and you worship your rulers, like the English fools, who when there's a royal wedding, or there's a coronation, or there's some celebration of royalty, They charge out and camp out days in advance, waiting for Her Majesty or one of these goons from the establishment whose wealth and power is unearned, is derived from blood relations, and is transferred from generation to generation and reflected in the upper lip syndrome and the posh accent, and then doing a bit of charitable work. And because of that, they deserve to be the rulers of society. This is the type of image that the Conservatives must angle for if they want to win over the population. The other image they occasionally turned out was like John Major, working class boy, done well, trying to raise up the unified nation and link together the establishment figures with someone who's striving to get on in life. So in other words, they angled, like during Thatcher's years and thereafter, they angled for the idea, well, if you get some money out of us, if, for example, I privatise Hyde Park and it produces a revenue of £20 billion and I give £50 to... Sorry?
It is privatised.
That's not privatised, but nearly. We've had disputes about these issues over many years, as you may well know. And I agree that this is an outrage. Because after all, the area they've just taken up here for British summertime, that's Speaker's Corner. So, and when they start this music in a couple of weeks' time, we won't be able to speak here. Now, maybe people think that's fine. The park raises revenue.
You'll be able to speak here when
Sorry?
You can speak here when British summer.
Yeah, but you obviously don't speak because you don't know that you actually can't speak. Because if you stand up here and you're only allowed to use your voice, and they've got Madonna singing Material Girl, you can barely be heard.
No, but
and there are waves of it, and every time they start that, I think, what's the point of me being at Speaker's Corner? Now, you might think, what does it matter? A couple of nutcases in Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon is not as important as raising £20 million from British summertime to finance activity in the park.
There's no
so
law
it's
against
a
you speaking
semi-privatisation, because the revenue goes, at least half of it goes to the park, I believe, and so some revenue generation, I think, is fair enough. The problem is when it becomes, they don't have to do it here. When the Rolling Stones played a free pop concert, they did it on the other side of the Serpentine. And I think that's actually where they should do this sort of stuff. And this area here should be promoted and developed like we've been doing at a grassroots level in order to promote discussion, debate, argument, understanding, intellect, exchange, and the human things that go on in Hyde Park on Speaker's Corner since the 1850s. And I think that is one of the most valuable things in British society. One of the reasons I live in Britain is because of Speaker's Corner. And I think that although it's denigrated in the mainstream press, you see a newspaper article, you look through the archives, do a search on Google, and you will see everything's about Speaker's Corner nutcase, Speaker's Corner extremists, Speaker's Corner lunatics, Speaker's Corner madness. We've had a few years when the House of Parliament have no longer looked quite what they looked like in the past. Nowadays, people don't have much faith in it. And so I think really what we require is a revival of mass participation. As a revolutionary Marxist, I believe that society should be run by the people, for the people. And by that I mean that democracy should penetrate into the structures of everyday life, control over housing, control over the community resources, control over local economy, control over national economy, control over global economy. And that, I believe, trumps the interests of private companies and trumps the interests of the elite who claim to be defending free speech. One of the reasons why the Conservative Party and politics in general is dominated by Harrow, Eton, Charterhouse Oxford and Cambridge is because they train their people to speak. In the Oxford Union, for example, it's a mini parliament. And they learn there to deal with the banter of parliament. So you speak and someone interjects and say, no, 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 like that. And then you respond to, but Mr. Speaker, and then you respond and start, you have this banter from the House of Commons that we from childhood, when we turn on television, get used to watching and think, oh, that's Parliament, how clever they are. Can you possibly face Prime Minister's question time? And you see that guy, well, he's sort of between a raccoon and an alien, Michael Gove, and he was like standing there in front of the television the other day, and he was going, you know, why you need to vote for me? You know, they were all asked, first sorry, I'll come back to that bit.
Raccoons
they
are
were all
very
asked.
intelligent. How
Sorry?
dare you say Michael Gove is like a raccoon?
Doesn't mean he's not intelligent.
Raccoons are very
He
intelligent.
could be an intelligent raccoon. No, he is intelligent. Michael Gove is intelligent. Fact. Does that qualify him to be the Prime Minister of Britain? Not really. There's plenty of intelligent people in the world. Now, they all turned around, they asked him a question. They said, what is your biggest weakness? So one of them turns around and he goes, well, some people say I'm a piece of shit. But you know, if there was no shit in the world, there'd be no fertilization. If there's no fertilization, there'd be no life on Earth. Therefore, the worst quality of me is that I promote life on Earth. And that was the sort of speech they made. Then the next one gets asked, you know, well, I'm a twit. But actually, twits are important because the clown in history was the most important figure to destroy the myth of supreme power of the gods. You know, and in that way, they sort of answer every single question they're asked. They got a plethora of answers they can throw in the air to confuse you and dust in your eyes. And so they've got this sort of fundamental question. Boris Johnson, you know, I won't misquote myself. So Boris Johnson, something like, imagine, you know, why did you strangle your girlfriend yesterday? And she asked you to leave your house and say, get off you. And then you shouted at her saying, get off my fucking laptop. Why did this happen? And he goes, well, that's nothing to do with any of you. And well, actually, the really important question is, what am I going to do on 31st of October, on Halloween? And Halloween, I'm going to make sure that we leave the European Union, no matter what. Well, we leave. Well, maybe we leave. And if we do, no, I didn't say maybe. I didn't say maybe. I said maybe we leave. Maybe, meaning May, is no longer being. Right? Because she was the last Prime Minister, and now I be. Boris be. Right? And so don't forget that actually Britain must be ruled by someone who's going to be determined to front out the European Union. We'll have no deal on the table, and when they come with a deal, we'll say we've got no deal on the table, because if we prepare for no deal, then we'll get the best deal. I could stand, couldn't I? I could win, you know. So the point is, you have a charade. Politics in Britain and around the world is a charade. You have members of the ruling classes and their lackeys and representatives jostling for position. Who can be the right person for the job? For the job. We've got 5 goons. The Prime Minister of England will be decided by now 2 goons. Jeremy, we won't say his second name, and Boris. Boris the man, someone pronounced his whole name the other day. I think it was about 15 different words. What was his full name? I can't remember. Boris, some really weird, long, elongated 50 letter word. No, it wasn't Karloff. No, it wasn't Karloff. But Walking Dead is partly true. So everybody knows this is a charade.
Hey, how do you know everybody?
Because I have psychic insight, my friend. I did an NLP course once, yeah, with Boris's brother. You know, there is a lot of this megalomania around. You're right. You're right to take me up on that, because there is a lot of this, you know, thinking that you know everything in the world. I don't know everything. I know 99.9%. Sorry?
Boris good enough?
Boris good enough for what? What's he going to do? I think his plan is as follows. Let's be clear. When you listen to the Tory party candidates, they let the ghost out.
Boring. Politicians.
What?
Politicians. Boring as hell.
Yes, but I'm trying to make a speech and it's going to be tedious to go off on just whether something's boring or not. I'll try and make it interesting as I go along. Don't worry, I'll bring some sex into it, some drugs, some rock and roll, and you'll be all excited. Love Island, who's shagging who. I'll bring it all into the meeting. Don't worry, but we have to get there first. We can't just jump straight to the meat of the conversation.
You're very rude.
What's rude about that? I'll tell you some rude things afterwards, maybe, my friend. If you behave yourself properly, you'll get lots of rudeness. Now, so when they let the cat out of the bag, when they turn around and say, well, how are you doing, Jan?
Hello.
Good to see you. This is our oldest comrade from Speaker's Corner, been at Speaker's Corner since the 1950s. Since the 1950s, quite an achievement. Now, to tolerate all us loonies over 50 years, 60 years, it's quite an 70 years, isn't it? 70 years. I usually do, my friend, I usually do. Sorry? My friend, have you been at Speaker's Corner in Australia or
There's a lot
something?
of people here that are not loonies.
Well, I would dispute that.
Very honest.
I don't think anybody is not a bit mad. Everybody has a certain madness within them. What is madness, after all? It's a relationship to the world which doesn't correspond to the general outlook on the world and perhaps wanders off like in a dream state into the absurd and peculiar.
Go back to politicians.
Right, thank you very much. I was waiting for that. So what would happen under either of the Conservatives? Well, they all said what they're really scared of is Jeremy Corbyn, the neo-Marxist or the Marxist coming to power. That's what they all said, right? They let the cat out of the bag. And if you ask them directly, they will tell you, worse than Brexit, no Brexit, or in between, no Brexit or in between, is Jeremy Corbyn coming to power. All of them said that. And in fact, they're joined in that, don't forget, by the majority of members of Parliament of the Labour Party, unfortunately. And this problem is at the core of what's going on in British society today. The number one fear in the establishment in Britain is that a Corbyn government comes to power. That's what it's all about. It's not actually about Brexit. The whole crisis emerged when Corbyn came to power. 2015, when he's elected, suddenly panic stations in the ruling class. And the entire establishment turned on him. The only reason they talk about referendum, the Liberals and the Labour Party right wing, is because they want to a whip to attack Jeremy Corbyn with. That's all it's about. Now they say, remember after the European elections, they're all screaming and shouting, Labour's going to get wiped out because of the European election result. A couple of days later in Peterborough, when a Labour MP was convicted of criminal offences, so everything pointed to a massive defeat for the Labour Party, they won. Why did they win? Because ultimately at the grassroots, there are wide layers of the British population who feel disenfranchised, who feel nobody represents them. And once you get an election, and Corbyn is able to go out and spread the message of the unity of the workers, whether leave or remain, of an expansion of services, expansion of healthcare, public ownership of the railways, of the major industries, perhaps of some of the banks. That is an alternative, not only in Britain, but internationally. And that has an appeal. Look at Bernie Sanders in America. Why does he come back? He's now, if he's not second favourite to win the Democratic candidacy. Why does he gain this support? Because the fundamental issues that led to Bernie Sanders, that led to Jeremy Corbyn, those issues remain central to British and world politics. Who controls society? Bankers, landlords, capitalists, or the mass of the people democratically controlling resources and publicly owning some of the core sections of the economy. Why is there a conflict? Why is there a conflict between America and China? What's it about? Is it because the slant eyes and the big noses need to fight each other? Is there some fundamental contradiction between the people of America and the people of China? No. The fundamental contradiction is between the socio-economic structure of power. In America, all the big companies and banks are privately owned. They want to use the government, Donald Trump and his entourage, as an instrument for advancing the interests of the ruling class, of increasing their wealth, power and prestige, of expanding their economic domination of the world, of expanding their military domination of the world, of holding and expanding. That's why when they shoot down a drone, the Americans start screaming, well, we're going to attack them with a cyber attack, or we're going to bomb them, or we're going to threaten their nuclear program. The Chinese have a different socio-economic system. It is based on public ownership and has proven to be, in the last 20 years, superior as an economic development model than any other experience in the history of humanity. And it is because of that that America, I'll take you 1 second, because of that America seeks the overthrow of the government of China. Because that government is based on public ownership of the commanding heights of the economy. Yes? Sorry? What? What's not true?
What we said about the Chinese economy, in fact, it's been doing so great over the last 20 years because it's all owned by the state. It's not true at all. In fact, China's economic rise has been predicated on the fact that since 1991 in Tiananmen...
Speak a bit louder, just so they can hear.
You can hear me? No. They can't hear me, all right.
So, I mean...
Okay, so you said that China's economy has done really, really well because it's all owned by the state. However,
I say all owned, I said dominated.
Dominated by the state. However, the reality is that China's great rise, which has come to dominate the late 20th century, early 21st century, has been predicated on the opening up of its economy since Tiananmen Square in 1991 to a huge amount of capitalism. Privately owned wealth, privately owned businesses, and that is what China's economy and its great rise has been based on, not the fact it has to be state-owned.
Yeah, I understand that argument.
It's not an argument, it's a fact.
Well,
and it's the exact
I
opposite
made an
of what you
argument, you said I'm wrong.
Yeah,
right?
I proved it.
So now you've made an argument,
And you're wrong.
you know, and I'm saying you're wrong. So it's not a big deal whether you say it's a fact or not. I mean, you mean I can't speak about it? Is that what you're saying?
I mean,
I can't respond to you.
You can counter the argument.
Well, if I counter, then I'm countering with what I believe the facts are, right?
So what I said is not true.
So, no, it doesn't matter. Yes, I'm saying what you're saying is not true, of course. Of course, yes. But it's not about...
The economy has to
I
be
don't
opened
mean
up
to...
China's
My
economy.
intention is to engage in a discussion
Yeah.
about the subject matter. Not to have a go at you for being wrong, or for you to try and say, I'm wrong.
No, but if I did
Fact, you're wrong.
But the premise
It's
of
not a
your
closed
argument-
debate.
No, of course,
right?
but the premise of your argument is false.
Well, that's what you're saying.
Yes.
So allow me to counter.
Yeah, go for it.
So well, that's what you do in a court. You know, in a court, one person presents their evidence, the other person presents their evidence.
Boss courts.
Sorry?
Boss courts.
What?
Boss courts.
Anyway, it's by the by.
Carry on.
So let's deal with the subject matter. The Chinese economy, many people believed, not really after Tiananmen, but after 1979 up until today, had been moving gradually, imperceptibly, but eventually overwhelmingly towards a privately owned market economy. That's the argument the gentleman here is making, and it's got widespread support in journalism and academia. So, sorry?
And reality.
Is it relevant for you to say that you're right? It's like you shout and I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. Silly. Right? Well, sorry? So,
I know, and you kept saying, let me tell you, I'm right.
well, maybe you are right,
carry on,
but then I'm giving you the argument about those who are wrong have an argument as well. So that's the argument I'm making. And then people are going to decide whether they agree with those who are wrong or those who are right. So that's the only way we can deal with it. Yeah? So it's not to offend your sensibilities, it's to discuss the subject matter.
Please continue.
So, actually, and I don't want to come out with too much data, because I can back up the data easily. I want to come out with a framework to understand the dynamics. So I think that's important, because I've been studying this question, well, really since just before Tiananmen Square. I went to China at that time. I was involved in the events in 1989 in East Germany. I lived in Berlin at the time, and I lived in East Germany just before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the question I was confronted with when I lived in Berlin and when I visited China in 1989 was, why are the Chinese able to have fax machines, photocopiers, restaurants, a far larger market for commodities, everyday consumer goods, than the East Germans were? Why is China able to have training shoes and, jeans and stuff like that when the East Germans don't really have, certainly not markets full of it, which the Chinese had? That perplexed me. And then when we attempted to make revolution in 1989 in East Germany, I worked in the underground in East Germany. We distributed illegal literature. We tried to organize an opposition Marxist tendency inside the university, at the Humboldt University. And we had some success in September, October 1989. But then on the 4th of November, there was a giant demonstration in Berlin. I was on the demonstration, and hundreds of thousands of people were demanding socialism and democracy. But 5 days later, the whole thing changed. The Berlin Wall was opened, and the regime basically lost control of society. And people traveled to the West. I remember someone who a few days before, he was working in a factory. And I discussed with him my ideas. And he said, that's brilliant, he says. He says, why don't we form a workers' council at our factory in East Berlin and take over the running of the factory? I said, yeah, go ahead. So we went back to his factory, tried to organize a workers' council. And then on the 10th of November, I met up with him the day after the Berlin Wall was opened. And I started talking to him about politics, and he said, yeah. He goes, yeah. He goes, but what about Kurfürstendamm, he said. That Extinction Rebellion indeed. The first butterfly in years. And it's a tortoiseshell. Now, so that's CO2, It's very good for life.
Get out of it. Don't even try that shit.
It's very good for life. Now, anyway, one sec. The parameter is this. I asked myself, why is it when the Berlin Wall was opened, the regime collapsed? And there was no way the regime could not collapse when the Berlin Wall opened. Because commodities in West Berlin were cheaper, of higher quality, and more available to anyone who had the money to go and buy those goods. That is why East Germany was doomed the moment the Berlin Wall was opened. Now, on the other side, in 1990, the day before, bear with me for a second, because you'll understand where I'm coming from. The day before East Germany unified with West Germany, I took an aeroplane to China. And I stayed in China for a year and a half. And I noticed this, and my studies since that have confirmed that. All the largest companies in China are publicly owned. They were and they are publicly owned. All the major banks in China are publicly owned. All the telecommunications companies are publicly owned. All the railway companies are publicly owned. The airports are all publicly owned. The rail stations are all publicly owned. The postal service is publicly owned. Even the advertising market is publicly owned. And what does that mean? Although they allowed private ownership to operate in buying and selling of houses, in Alibaba, in a number of internet companies, Alibaba now being one of the biggest companies in the world, biggest IPO in the world. And yet, despite from 1979 accepting the existence of private ownership and the development of private companies and private enterprise and the employment of workers and commodity production for profit, Despite that, from 1979 until today, what's that, 40 years? 40 years since that time. Despite that, China's economy remains dominated by public ownership. So what does that mean? It means when you've got a private artisan, fruit juice, Starbucks, Kentucky, McDonald's in China, where does the money go? At night time when they close the shop and they want to put the money somewhere, where does it go? They run off to the bank with a big sack of money, they open the safety deposit box, they chuck it in the box, shut the box, into the hands of the state. Into the hands of the state. And that state money is then re-siphoned back towards the state economy. 66% of all bank loans in China go to the state economy. If you want to be a private company, and you want to borrow money from a bank, your chance of you getting any money almost zero. You got a small private company, you want to borrow money, you borrow from your friends. You don't borrow from the bank. You don't have access to bank finance. Only large-scale private enterprises have access to banking finance. And therefore, they are charged higher interest rates than the state banks. Than state companies. The state companies get what you call low interest loans. And then when they can't pay back those loans, the government kicks the can down the road and makes the terms of the agreement, instead of 20 years, 30 years. Instead of 30 years, 50 years. In other words, they are giving grants to state-owned enterprises which accumulate resources from the private sector to invest in the public sector. That is what is driving and has driven China's economy since 1979. That's how it operates. That's the theoretical framework to understand the dynamics of the facts of what's happening in China. That's what my PhD is about, by the way.
Sure, but very impressive. But the point is that the trend doesn't support that, does it? China's economy was doing much worse, and now it's doing much, much better. And in between the time when China's economy was doing badly and when it's been doing very, very well, China's economy has opened up much more to private enterprise. So your suggestion that China's rise is being predicated on and is because of China's the dominance of China's economy by the state is not supported, because the trend suggests the opposite. As they've opened up, they've become. You gave a chronological period that you thought was the period of change. Yeah. In fact, when Tiananmen Square happened, in the 2 years after Tiananmen Square happened, it was basically illegal to start private companies. 50% of the private sector collapsed in 2 years after 1989. So the initial statement you made about the movement towards capitalism being accelerated by 1989 is incorrect. And it's logical because, after all, the party under Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng at the time believed that if they allow the private sector to develop, it will promote ideas like freedom and democracy, like we're seeing in Hong Kong at the moment. And the consequence of that would be an undermining of the power of the party. And the party in China is based on control of public sector enterprises. The word for Communist Party in China is Gongchangdan, and Gongchangdan means public sector party, public ownership party. That's what it means. It doesn't mean anything else. The public ownership is what the party is. It doesn't represent anything else. Now, most party members work for the public sector. There are around 60 million people who officially work for the public sector, but actually the number of people working for the public sector has risen to about 110 million people in the last 5 years. It's gone up significantly in the last few years. And in China, if you check up the phrase yourself, there's a phrase used, 国进民退, which means private retreats, public advances. And this is what's been going on in the last, since Xi Jinping came to power. Now, I can give you an example of that. I give you a tiny example of that from a private anecdote from this week. Just a little one for your own interest. I took a Chinese oil trading company on a Karl Marx walking tour this week. And normally... I've seen the signs.
Sorry?
I've seen the signs.
You may have done. Normally, these people As well, yeah. Normally, these people, in the last years, they used to be quite hostile towards Marxism and communism. This time, they were extremely interested, extremely carefully following what was going on, and all sorts of laws have been introduced in China to move back towards a more planned and centrally controlled economy. For example, if you're a director of a state-owned enterprise in China now, you're only allowed to earn 2 times the income of a worker. It used to be 50 or 100 times the income. Now, even the biggest bank in China, the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, the CEO of the company only earns $85,000 a year. 85,000. And you have a cynical look on your face because I know many people, I've just explained to you, many people know that in the past there used to be a huge amount of corruption. A friend of mine worked for a large state-owned chemical company, and he used to tell me about 5 years ago that people would come to the bosses of state-owned companies. They would pull out a suitcase. They would open the suitcase and say, here's 1 million yuan to make this deal. Only you and I know about this. And so the temptation was enormous to take the money. On the other side, the danger was even bigger, and the danger has become much bigger now. Over 1 million, I think it's 2 million actually, party members have been, they have 2 laws in China. One law is the general law for the population. The second law is the party law. Party law is superior to the general law in China. You can be arrested by the Communist Party if you're a Communist Party member and put in detention indefinitely if you have committed a crime against the laws of and statutes of the Communist Party. And millions of people in China have been arrested for corruption and embezzlement. And this is why nowadays you won't see, you look around Speaker's Corner, when these Chinese officials come in their suits, you look at them, you won't find one of them wearing a Rolex watch or a, Patek watch or one of these things. They used to, but the problem was this. When they went to restaurants, they would go and sit in a restaurant. One minute. They would go and sit in a restaurant, and the waitress would come over with a mobile phone, take a snap of it, post it on the internet, and that would launch what they call a human flesh hunting. And people all across China would look who this person is, and that person would fall from power and end up in prison.
Why? Because he has a Rolex watch.
Yes.
What kind of stupid law is that? What
I'm
kind of stupid
describing
ideology
to
is
you,
that?
the gentleman was asking me what the internal dynamics in China are. He believed that the private sector had been advancing so much that China had become capitalist. I was arguing that's not the case, and that the appearances that looked like it was moving towards capitalism, actually that's not the process that's been happening, certainly for the last 5 years, but also for the last 20 years.
You know, I don't agree with him. I don't think China will become a capitalist
But he
country.
thinks it's already
I
capitalist.
think China will become an oligarchy. And in fact, it's very close already to be an oligarchy.
true.
Because the people in power have ownership over everything in the country.
Well,
absolutely everything. Like Putin in Russia, he has huge
I think
ownership of Gazprom. He basically owns most of Gazprom. And I wanted to ask you just 2 questions about what you were saying a while ago.
Can I just quickly respond to that?
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, I do agree there is a distinction. If you look at what happened in China, and you look what happened in Russia, I think that's the distinction. Yes, the Communist Party in China has a number of people whose command over the large enterprises, if it was turned into capital, could become oligarchs just like the Russian oligarchs. That's true. But why on earth should they do that? Because the reason why it happened in the Soviet Union was because the Soviet Union economically disintegrated. It had had a long period of stagnation. And that's because the capacity to accumulate surplus from the movement of people from the countryside to the cities. If you move people, for example, in China, from the countryside to an urban environment, the productivity of those workers increases by about 60 to, well, about 300 times, better said. So 3 times the amount of production if you live in a city than if you live in the countryside. Russia already urbanized in the 1960s. So there was no scope to accumulate from the urbanization process. The economy had stagnated since the early 1970s. That's why the Soviet Union collapsed. That's why East Germany collapsed. China is not at that position. China is similar, if you like, chronologically, you could locate it in the 1950s. It's in a similar About 50% of the population live in the cities. The rest live in the countryside. However, the double element which promotes the Chinese economy is that they also allowed the private sector to develop and to accumulate from the private sector via the transfer I discussed, private to state, state to state, for investment and development. And if you're a ruler in China, one of the Politburo, Central Committee, one of the top 500,000 party members who control the leading elements of the administration in China, if you control those things and you're seeing progress, you're seeing development, you're controlling investment programs of a gigantic scale, unprecedented in world history, like the Belt and Road Initiative, to link together 60% of the entire world by road, rail and shipping. If you're in charge of such prestigious projects, why do you need to become a private sector oligarch who has to run around the world hiding from the rulers? You don't need to do it. And that's the difference between the Soviet Union and China. Yes, China could go that way, but it has not gone that way to date. And those people who do that, they take it down. Even the head of Alibaba, Jack Ma, who was quite outspoken, quite individualist, certainly entrepreneurial and capitalistic, for he was many times for 14 different jobs he was refused before he became a capitalist. And yet, only last year they showed he was a Communist Party member all along. And party cells control the direction of the company. It's a private company ostensibly, but actually it's carrying out party policy. Sorry, go on.
No, I'd say that you are at least half right, because it does have a lot to do with the economy of the country, but I think it has a lot more to do with the structure of power itself. Yes. The main reason why the Soviet Union disintegrated was because it was a totalitarian state, and they were trying to implement rules that would make the state less totalitarian, that would make more, like perestroika and glasnost, the two things that basically ended the Soviet Union. You can't quite coordinate that liberation and the iron grip by which the Soviet Union was ruled throughout most of its history.
Possibly.
And when that power, that iron grip loosened and it got disintegrated, then the oligarchs had a big power grab, and people who were little nobodies, they just grabbed a whole lot of power. And why is China not an oligarchy now? Well, because those people already have the power. The difference between an oligarchy and a dictatorship is that the oligarch grabs that power by other means. Officially, he's not the ruler, but unofficially, he's the one who actually owns most of the power. That's how it is in Ukraine right now. A certain group of oligarchs have overthrown another group of oligarchs. Pro-Western oligarchs have overthrown pro-Russian oligarchs. That's how it is now.
I agree with you. That's what happened. The analysis of the central question as to why the Soviet Union collapsed. Firstly, the background idea I presented was the economy had already frozen up, and therefore they were in crisis. Their natural motivation, don't forget, most of the people who became oligarchs in the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the different republics that broke away from the Soviet Union, most of the people who became oligarchs were system insiders. They were Communist Party members, generally in Moscow, in Russia. They were members of the Komsomol. And they were given the resources from the banks. When Yeltsin came to power, he said, I will give you money to buy the Russian economy, but you must serve Russia. That was the deal with Putin as well. Now, that's why some people, like Khodorkovsky, ended up in prison, and other people, like Bezarovsky, well, they didn't mind. He did certain things, but they didn't mind. He can come around, travel around the world, represent, as long as they don't clash too openly with Moscow. Now, that was because when the regime collapsed in 1986 to 1991, under perestroika and glasnost, the opening up of the economy and the opening up of debate brought out tensions between each area. Because the economy was not expanding, there were no resources to placate the population with. So the idea came along, Jeffrey Sachs and many advisors from the World Bank, they came and said, just privatize it immediately. Hand the money to a few people and they will do the investment. And gradually the economy will begin to resemble capitalism. The Chinese, however, the Communist Party in China, made a study of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that study lasted until 2004. The party research institutions studied the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they said it wasn't actually glasnost, it wasn't perestroika, it was the internal crisis inside the economy that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was structural, foundational. And so their decision was, rather than apply these methods, you should maintain control over the central sections of the economy and accumulate for the private, and never allow the establishment of a bourgeois democratic tendency, like the idea of general elections, freedom of political parties, and so on. So that, of course, is why they won't allow Hong Kong to declare independence, or even Taiwan to declare independence. That's also why they won't allow, that's why their policy, which if you look at what's going on in Xinjiang, for example, where the Uyghurs are being detained and re-educated, it's classical Maoism. They talk about thought reform. So they're putting the whole, or not the whole, but maybe a third of the population into training camps to change their minds. Now that is not the methodology of a capitalist company or capitalist enterprises and capitalist government trying to prepare the people for capitalism. It's the mentality of a bureaucracy typical of Stalinism in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe and China under Mao, which seeks to control the population by getting them assimilated within the structures of state power and the driving forces of the economy that the Chinese bureaucracy still administer. The expansion of the Chinese economy in modern times is almost, at least in the last 5 years, is almost entirely attributable to state investment programs. Almost even the private sector growth is due to that.
Yes, I thought Taiwan was quite independent already.
Well, yes, but they won't allow it to declare independence.
But they have a different government.
Yes, but if Taiwan declared independence, China would invade.
They can't invade Taiwan.
Well, they can.
Well, technically they can, but they're surrounded by American bases already.
Well, that's right. That's why.
They won't do it.
But officially, Taiwan is not recognized at the United Nations as a country because China vetoes it, and the Americans aren't prepared to say Taiwan actually is independent.
Well, the eastern Ukrainian regions are also not recognized, and yet the Ukrainian government has no power over them.
Right, but China's a big player. Ukraine's not so big.
Ukraine is not a big player. Russia is a bigger player. That's why but they're still not recognized. But Taiwan.
But Taiwan's a long historical thing. The Taiwanese under the Kuomintang said they were the government of China. So the Kuomintang, as most people would know it, they call themselves the government of all of China. And the Communist Party of China declares it is the government of all of China, including Taiwan. Now,
they can declare as much as they want. They have no power over the reason.
Neither here nor there for the discussion at the moment. It's neither here nor there for the discussion at the moment, except in this I was asked earlier on, what about Hong Kong? Well, this is what's going on in Hong Kong, isn't it? There is a movement to demand autonomy from mainland China, or to maintain great autonomy and increase that autonomy from mainland China. That movement's a big movement the last few weeks. But obviously the Chinese are never going to allow them to declare independence.
Hong Kong is different, because Hong Kong is geographically connected to China. Now Taiwan is a much more difficult situation because the Chinese will need to physically invade Taiwan. You know what I mean? And Hong Kong technically already has.
It's only a few miles from
fine. But
the Chinese
might not
could.
look like much.
But
that's why the Germans didn't conquer Britain, because of that small gap of water. That's the main reason.
It's neither here nor there. The dynamics officially is what I'm talking about.
That kind of geography is important.
China will never allow Taiwan to declare independence. Officially.
Fine.
Now, if they were to do
practice,
so,
it's not
they would look weak. If they look weak, all the different areas of China that got minorities might declare independence as well.
Of course, because
so
China, just like the Soviet Union, is gripping their people with an iron fist. And if they get a perestroika or glasnost, they will collapse.
There are two sides to an iron fist. You can rule with an iron fist as long as, for a period of time just by violence. But generally, you can only rule over a people, like Machiavelli said, consent and force. You have to balance the two things. You cannot simply rule by force. The Chinese state,
neither by simply consent.
contrary to what most people think, the Chinese state has enormous reserves of social support in the population in China. You don't have 80 million Communist Party members, a tenth of the adult population, if you've got no support in society. Nor do you have.
I'm not going to start again about the body count that took to get that support. The people are scared.
I mean,
They'll get killed. They have the most developed surveying system in the world. They have a credit system, the social credit system, that if they do something against
there
the
is a lot of
government,
truth. When I was a kid and my dad drove us to school, my dad's Chinese, when he pulled over at school, everyone's going tinky tinky like that. And it is true that it's more difficult to recognise one Chinese person from another out of 1.6, 1.5 thousand million people. It's not easy to tell who's who. Even in Britain, where you've got a variety of people, when they did these experiments in facial recognition, they had difficulty recognising who was who. What was that? Well, no, he was saying the surveillance system over the population is so ubiquitous and powerful, and everybody lives in fear. That's not correct. Most people
listen to you with less bloody pessimism if you were to admit this and discuss it.
What?
Discuss what he just said.
Oh, but
there is a great
he has
surveillance. You can't look at Tibet and Xinjiang and all these other places that are really under the.
I don't really get the connection between what
Well,
I said and what you're saying. So
I did mention Xinjiang. I didn't talk about Tibet, but I did mention the camps in Xinjiang only a few minutes ago. So it's not like I'm not acknowledging that. But if you talk about the general population in China, that's the Han Chinese. They're 90% of the population. And amongst the Han Chinese, the support for the Communist Party is overwhelming. And there are multiple studies on that.
How honest is that support?
The Pew Research.
You don't get a job.
Pew
Research. Dude, Heiko,
Sorry?
you know about
You don't get a job. You don't get a house. You
Exactly.
don't get entrance to things
Exactly.
if you're not part of the scene.
I mean,
Exactly.
Well, if you don't understand
that's not true.
It's like
You're
nowadays,
just
you can get
turning
fired
true.
for saying something that is not
I mean,
politically correct.
I mean,
I know. I've already got one.
I lived in East Germany. In East Germany, that was true.
Yeah.
The Stasi, the secret police, was ubiquitous. You didn't know who was watching over you, but you knew somebody was watching over you. In China, that's not the case. I mean, I've been visiting China on and off since 1989. I've been visiting China on and off since 1989. And every single year, well, apart from the last couple of years, it's become more free, more open, more accessible for people to communicate, discuss, debate, argue. And plenty of people who I know, actually this is part of the key, which answers your question. Part of the key as to why the regime has been able to garner this support is because within your terrain, for example in the art world, I know a number of people who like quite high up in the art world, they're able to express themselves openly and freely.
No, they're not. I
Which
spoke to many of them.
which you were not able to do. You were not able to do under Mao Zedong. Under Mao Zedong, you could not even paint a picture
Well,
of
thank
Mao
you. It's
Zedong.
slightly better than doing Mao
It's not
Zedong.
slightly better.
It's impossible
It's
to
not
get much
slightly
worse
better.
than Mao Zedong. Okay, Heiko, let's
Slightly
tick
better.
the boxes. Let's
It's
tick the boxes.
completely
Heiko,
different.
Come on, let's
It's
tick the boxes.
totally
Let's compare
and completely
East
different.
Germany to
For
China
example,
now.
just one sec, just
Okay,
one
go
sec.
ahead, go ahead.
Ai Weiwei, for example. What's that?
Well, let
I
him.
want you to be better, but you're never going to go.
Well, then
let
don't
him-
have to
let-
hang
let-
around.
let him
do
finish,
you?
let him finish.
Don't have to split. Tony. Why always, whenever you're at a meeting I'm at, whether it's, and I'm going to take your person on this, whether it's something I've organised, whether it's my own meeting at Speaker's Corner, whether it's from your platform, or whether it's at a private training event that I organise, you always just denigrate rather than promote. The only time you didn't do that was at your own educational class, your own comedy school. Every other time.
Comedy school.
He had a comedy school, and he's very good. I came to his comedy club. That's the only time you didn't take that moaning cynicism to the extreme. It's not that I find it impossible to deal with. I just don't understand why you do it.
Maybe he's a
Why?
professional.
Why?
He's
Why so
a heckler.
cynical and
Because
moaning?
actually,
He's
It's not-
heckling.
it doesn't,
both know
it doesn't
we're
advance
actually
the
mates,
meeting.
But where we
Well, that's
fall
fine, but
down
I'm
is,
just pointing
I
out to
believe
you.
Marxism has got brilliant
Fine.
analysis, lousy conclusions.
Fine.
That's what I believe.
Fine, but you've
And
said
then
that 30
listen-
I don't
years.
even think the
listen to
analysis
your
is
You said that
brilliant
30
analysis,
years.
And I want brilliant conclusions, and you give me lousy
But you've
conclusions.
told me there are
When
no
you
good
actually make
conclusions.
it so-
You've told me you've already concluded they're only lousy conclusions. So it's self-evident I'm going to give you lousy conclusions. You might weigh up the lousiness though and say, oh, that's less lousy than that, rather than just how lousy, 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 which is what you do all the time. You know, a bit of mirror, you know.
Okay, what were you saying?
Where was I?
I don't remember.
I don't remember either.
That's it. It's gone.
About me,
It's
I
gone.
rather like that.
But
even
either
I'm
way,
glad,
okay,
I'm glad,
okay,
I'm glad you appreciate
Let's
that.
compare. Let's compare the situation.
Oh, you wanted East Germany,
East
China,
Germany
yeah.
and China.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just tick the boxes to see if it fits together, if they can be compared to each other. Okay. So totalitarian government that holds on all the power. Check. Check. A huge amount of people killed to achieve that regime. A huge democide. Check. Check. What else do you need, Heiko? Do you need more things? And
Do what?
To compare the two.
Well, there are
That's the
some-
most important
well,
thing.
But I pointed out I've been involved in analysing the politics and economics of both East Germany and China. I had a personal connection with both of those areas, and I've been doing research on those questions since before
do you deny
1989.
that the Chinese have
so
a very
because of that,
developed
because of
surveillance
that,
system?
what I would say is the following. The East German state structure and party structure is fundamentally the same as the Chinese. Fundamentally the same. But they are different in many, many ways.
For example,
The only time that China and East Germany and China, or China today, resembled East Germany was in the period 1949 to 1961. In that period, there was no Berlin Wall, right? So in that period, anybody could leave East Germany and anybody could enter East Germany, at least East Berlin. And the commodities available in the West were available in West Berlin, so you just walked across the road and bought them. And if you wanted to work in the West, you just walked across the road and worked there. Up until 1961, there was no Berlin Wall. And so anybody could freely move around. And there were, therefore, elements of the market economy in East Germany, implanted by the West. But inside the East, they tried to seal it all off and close it all off. And that's why the bureaucratic solution was to impose the Berlin Wall. Now, the Americans at the moment are pushing against the Chinese to restrict the sales potential of the private sector of China. Most of the things bought by the American population, Walmart, things like that tariffs are being slapped on, are produced by private companies in China. So the intention of the Trump administration is to strangle the Chinese private sector, to force the Chinese government to institute ever greater state control, and then hope that the Chinese government will collapse due to democratic impulses coming from different regions of China, like Hong Kong. And therefore, the American strategy is to push the Chinese towards a more and more centralized structure resembling the old East German or Soviet Union, because they know how that collapses. Now, the Chinese have carried out a policy quite different to that, but they are being forced by the American policies towards more and more, or forced in inverted commas, within the parameters of that structure of power that resembles the East German Communist Party in all basic, or Socialist Unity Party, in all basic elements. It's the same structure, the same thinking, the same approach. And that is that the bureaucrats that control the economy, politics, society, and all institutions in society, from women's organizations to children's organizations, all these institutions are controlled by the Communist Party. And therefore, the driving force in their motivation for getting up in the morning, for doing what they do at school or college or in a women's organization or in a minority organization or in a church organization or in a political organization or in their enterprise, the motivation is the self expansion and preservation of the institution that they serve and that they get their job from. That's what the motivation of a bureaucrat is. That's the same in the army in Britain.
That's why they joined the party.
It's not only the party and state.
You just answered a question you asked earlier.
Yes.
When
Yeah,
I
okay.
said why lots of people join the party for all sorts of coercive reasons.
now the distinct-
You've just documented all those coercive
Well,
reasons.
hang on a minute.
That's why there's
Those
so
aren't
many
just
people in
coercive,
the
though.
Communist
Those
Party
aren't just
in
coercive.
China.
If someone's part of a
just answered your
program,
own question that
if
you
someone's
just
part of a
answered a minute
program
ago.
for poverty eradication, is that personal prestige? Maybe a little bit. Is it I joined the party for some personal advancement if my objective is poverty eradication? And they've had the biggest poverty eradication of any country in human history in the last 20 years. Well, that's the motivation. That's the motivation that drives them. Just like a British general or a British army officer, when they're involved in the British army, they don't think, oh, how can I make a profit out of this weapon? They think, how can we make this weapon serve the functions and purposes of the British Army? And they have a pride in their army, a pride in their country, so-called, but it's not a privately driven motivation to make profit as it is under capitalism. So my point about the difference between China and East Germany and East Germany, the correspondence between China and East Germany, as compared with England, France, Germany and America, is that the fundamental driving force controlling the society is motivated by totally different objectives, aims, and the utilization of manpower and resources. That's why China's development is different to America's, is different to Russia's, is different to East Germany. That's why China is developing the specific difference with the Soviet Union. And the Chinese concluded this, by the way. In their study of the collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, the party Central Party School made a detailed study, and they concluded that the problems in the Soviet Union began after the death of Stalin, when instead of carrying out the policies that Khrushchev proposed, that was to allow private enterprise to develop alongside the state sector, surrounding the state sector, so the state sector could accumulate from the private sector. They didn't do this. They removed Khrushchev and moved to centralization again. The automatic tendency of bureaucrats is centralization. So there is a dilemma, a contradiction within it between the drive to centralization, which is an automatic tendency, and then the need for development and the need for gaining support, which means allowing commodity production, private enterprises and so on. There is a tension within that. It resolved itself in the Soviet Union with the rise of Stalin or better said, with the third period in 1928 to 31, with all the consequences from it.
Well,
in China,
exactly,
it's
with
gone
all
the
the
opposite way round.
consequences from
yes,
it.
but in China it went the opposite
How
way round.
do we implement world peace? Just nuke everyone and kill everyone. It
It's not
resolves.
about-
It
it's not
solves
about-
the problem,
no,
man. There is no war.
You will accept, because
dude-
I understand you're honestly analysing what happened
Okay,
in
Heiko,
your
you're
country.
basically saying
Let me just
cut
say
off
what-
the
what's-
arm if your finger is hurt.
What do you mean cut off the arm?
That's what you're talking about. You're solving relatively small problems with very extreme measures, man.
My friend, I didn't advocate, I'm describing.
No, you're not advocating. You're just
I'm describing
defending
what's
China
happening.
when China is very similar to what happened in East Germany
What I
and in the
advocate
Soviet
is
Union.
something slightly different. I advocate
Slightly
out of the existing situation. In the West, for example, I advocate workers' parties coming to power, so the Labour Party in Britain coming to power, public ownership of the largest enterprises, parallel with China, and democratic control of the administration of those enterprises and politics and economics. That's what I advocate for Britain.
Okay.
So that's where you can see the parallel developing with my argument about why I support the Chinese economic policy, is because I advocate the same thing for Britain.
Okay.
Now, what do I advocate for China? I advocate in China that they implement what it says in the constitution about workers having the right to elect the managers of the workplaces. That is written into the constitution in China. It's true that because the government is representing this dictatorial party apparatus, they don't actually implement that. But because the working class is a powerful force in society and is able to stamp its authority and mark on the political process, So they are able more and more to push the government to carry out policies that serve their needs. So it's not true to say, even in the worst periods of totalitarianism in China and the Soviet Union or East Germany or Romania, even in North Korea, even in the worst, what we'd consider to be, you know, the hoorah Stalin phase or the hoorah Kim Jong-un, they don't just hold power by force.
Yeah,
That's
they do.
not correct.
No, it's
they
not.
hold power by giving concessions as well, or by the
Heiko,
people
you've
demanding
got to be
control.
kidding
Let me give
me.
you an illustration of what I mean. When East Germany collapsed, there was an article in Spiegel magazine. They interviewed a simple worker and they said to him, "How are things now?" He said, "Well, in the old days, if you came to Alexanderplatz in East Berlin and you said, 'Down with Honecker, down with the Communist Party,' you'll be arrested and imprisoned. You disappear. But if you said in your workplace, 'Our manager is useless, let's remove him,' and you talk to 5 other workers, the chances of you removing him were very high.
Thank
If
you.
on the other
thank
side,
you.
if on the other side, under West German control, after German unification, you could go on to Alexanderplatz or you could go to Bonn, where the government was, and you could say, 'Down with Chancellor Kohl, down with the German government.' The police are going to walk past you and not blink an eyelid. They don't care what you say about the government. They couldn't give 2 hoots if 1 million people protest against
wait,
Brexit.
but you want to
They
say
couldn't
that they
give a
will
shit
care
what you
if you
think.
talk shit about your manager.
But if you turn around and say, 'My manager McDonald's
Nah, that's bullshit, man.
an idiot, let's remove him,' you'll never get rid of him. They'll sack you
but
straight
they-
away.
no, they
right?
won't.
So there's a different balance of power in society.
Heiko, you're making
Why
a false
is there a
comparison.
difference? Just let me bear with me for a second. Just for a second, then come back. Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Why is there this difference? Because in a publicly owned enterprise, where the objectives are mission-based objectives rather than profit-based objectives, then the manager has to also seek to accumulate resources to develop that mission. Let's say expand a university department, get more investment in the resources for research in biology. How are you going to get those resources? The government says, let's make a plan to what to do with the resources for the country. What do? Do you put in exactly what your plan is? No, you ask for more than you need because you know there's going to be a bargaining negotiation between central power, between one bureaucracy and another bureaucracy. You try and get what you can by posturing for more. And in doing so, you also posture on behalf of the workers you represent. The managers become representatives of the workforce in trying to get resources for development of their sector of the economy.
All right, Heiko,
And
time
that
out, time out.
happened in the Soviet
Time out,
Union,
time out.
it happened in Yugoslavia, it happens
Sure,
today
sure
in China.
Heiko, come on. Okay.
It's the
Okay,
main
wait.
dynamic.
Heiko, first of all, why is it that if you can choose your manager, you can't choose your ruler? The hierarchy of power if considering the hierarchy of power, the ruler is way more important than the manager. If you change the ruler, the new ruler can make you be able to choose your manager, and thus
Wow.
it becomes better. That's the first point. The second point is publicly owned how? What the hell is publicly owned if you can't choose anything? If the government is a totalitarian government, what is this publicly owned that you keep preaching about? It's nothing. It's a false concept. It's like me telling you, okay, you have the freedom to go over there, but if you go over there, I'll shoot you in the head. What kind of freedom is that, Heiko? It is no freedom, Heiko. Okay, and the last part. Of course you were not. If you spoke about freedom, you would debunk yourself in 5 minutes.
No, we were comparing different socio-economic systems. That's all. I'm not making a moral statement about it. I'm comparing what their internal dynamics are. You said, what difference does it make? It makes a lot of difference because the system in China has certain internal impulses. We began the discussion this afternoon about what are the driving forces in China. Someone began the argument, if you check on the video, he said to me, China is dominated by the private sector private capitalists are driving the dynamics of Chinese society and economics. That is the main argument I am contesting. I am saying China is driven by the dynamics of a bureaucratic plan of the economy. That is why, and this is where the distinction comes in, that is why China is developing rapidly as an economy, and its infrastructure and resources are developing at an astronomical rate
Heiko, that's not
unseen
what I'm
by
talking
any
about.
other country in human history. At the same time as comparative countries like India or Brazil that have all the potential to develop in terms of the natural resources and manpower, to develop faster in theory
Sure.
than China, and yet they do not. You go to India, you land in Delhi, the capital city, and you're 300 meters from the airport and the road turns to dust. Dust. There's not even a paving on the road.
They're handicapped
You drive
by
in.
religion. They're handicapped by religion.
As
No.
well, as well.
Come on.
But in Brazil, it's not really religion, although religion played a role with Bolsonaro. It's not really
In
that.
Brazil,
it's because
the socialists have ruined the
dominant
country.
sectors of the economy are in private hands or serve private interests.
Heiko, you
And
know what
therefore-
Lula and Dilma
therefore-
did in
just
Brazil?
Bear with me a
No,
second.
but Heiko, I can't
bear with me
bear
one
with
second,
you
I'll come
if
back
I'm
to
talking
Lula.
about
I'll
something
come back
and you
to Lula.
completely divert the conversation to something that has zero to do with what
it's
I
not-
was
it's
saying.
no.
And then you say, "Oh, okay, I answered your question." You
No,
didn't
I'm-
even
I'm trying
speak
to
about my
clarify
question.
what the distinction is
Heiko,
that I'm making.
not talking about
because
distinctions.
You said,
I'm asking you, Heiko, I'm asking you, what does it mean for you that in China everything is publicly owned? If the government is totalitarian, then the term publicly owned is empty.
Well, I'm trying to-
it doesn't exist.
what I was trying to do
What
was
does
to
it mean in
explain to
China?
you see, Marxists, they say that everything is driven by its internal contradictions. So I'm trying to point out what the internal contradictions are. Because if you get them wrong, you will never understand the dynamics you're observing, right? So that's the argument I'm making.
Go on, divert.
So, what is the driving force? I'm saying public ownership is driving. You're saying now we need to get onto the question, which I'll deal with now.
Because there is no
What
public
i-
ownership.
Well,
Everything is owned by the government. They do whatever they can.
which is
They
called-
got the muscles,
okay,
they got
okay,
the army.
Okay, it's called public ownership. Now,
You can call it however you want.
but there,
The public doesn't own anything.
if the essence of the dynamics of that system are different, it's important to distinguish the way it works, right?
Yes.
If I've got a handgun or I've got a machine gun, yes, they both kill people, true. But one kills people at one rate and another at another rate. One's good for one function in one particular type of military conflict and another in another. They are different dynamics behind it. So, what was Marx doing? What did Marx do in London? It's my speciality. He researched the system of capitalism. Why did he research capitalism? Why didn't he spend his time designing some communist utopia? Surely he could have spent 40 years doing that. But instead of that, he analysed the system and its internal contradictions
Because you
that
have
he
to
lived
know
in.
your enemy to beat your enemy.
Because
and
you have to
capitalism
know
was his
what
enemy.
is in order to create something different
There you go.
out of what is.
There you go.
So understanding the difference between the internal dynamics of Brazil, of India, of America, of England, and of China and the Soviet Union allows you to analyse how that society will move, what the internal dynamics of it are, and therefore how the political process will appear differently, and the dynamics of revolution, of democracy, of the struggle for freedom, of the struggle for free speech, of the struggle of nationalities, of the economic dynamics, all of them will appear differently in China than they appear here. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and China, change generally came about in two ways. One was political change. One was internal contradictions within the bureaucracy and the communist parties cause a split inside the communist parties themselves. A faction of the Communist Party begins to advocate more democratic control, like Glasnost in 1985 under Gorbachev, or like Imre Nagy in 1956 in Hungary, or like the Heinrich-Janka-Gruppe in 1953 in East Germany. Or like Dubček's, Alexander Dubček's ideas in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. Or like developed in Yugoslavia under Tito, where for 40 years, don't forget, for 40 years of the existence of Yugoslavia, the people elected the managers of the workplaces.
Oh, no,
Fact,
no,
they did.
no,
They
no,
elected the managers. Maybe you don't like that, but they did do that. Now,
I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about.
and there was a
man.
movement called Workers' Councils Movement in 1968 in Yugoslavia as well.
Okay,
So
Heiko.
These are the dynamics
Heiko,
of,
stop it,
hang on,
stop
the
it, Heiko.
dynamics of change in these countries. 1953.
Heiko, your fanboys might not
1956,
notice this
19,
because they are in love
just
with
give me
you.
1 second.
But you're not
Give me 1
answering
second.
anything I'm asking you.
I am answering
all I
exactly
want to
what you're
know
answering, what you're
is
asking.
all I want to know is how do you have public property in a dictatorship? In a totalitarian dictatorship, where is that public property? What does the public own? If the government has ultimate power, where is it? What's your definition of that? You're just giving me these examples and examples and examples, and you're running. Wait. And you're running away from the questions, miles away.
Okay, I'll deal with it directly. Then
And you're saying, oh, I'm
you'll
answering
see
it, I'm
the
answering
connection.
it.
You'll see the connection.
There is no
Why do
connection.
people turn their backs
Heiko.
on socialism?
It's another question.
Heiko,
We'll come on to.
stop it. Stop
Why
it.
do they
I'm
turn
going
their
to answer
backs
exactly
Answering
what you
anything.
just asked.
Just answer the
I'll
question.
try and do that.
Okay, go ahead.
Why do we
Public-
turn our backs on them?
Public ownership has many forms. Right?
Okay.
Most of the forms of public ownership that we experience are dictatorial forms. Fact, Hyde Park is publicly owned, but we don't control it. Right? They can put that concert there because a couple of people, the chief executive of the park, in conjunction with the Secretary of State, can sign a piece of paper and hand over the
pay
park
for the park,
to a
though.
private company.
It does
If,
pay for the
however,
park.
and that park,
He's
the
fin- he's
gentleman
finally
said,
addressing.
it
He's
partly
finally addressing.
finances the resources of the park that have been taken away from the park because government funding has been cut, right? So, is it a public park? Yes. Is it used as a public park? Yes. Is it always used for the public purposes? No. Is it controlled by the public? No. Do we have any institutions to allow us to control it? No. There is no democratic structure that allows the people who use Hyde Park or the people who would like to use it or the people in the area to control Hyde Park. None. Therefore, Hyde Park is no different to the public ownership in the Soviet Union or the public ownership in China. Now, there are different forms of public ownership. For example, just one sec. There are different forms of public ownership in China. They do have, but all land in China is publicly owned. All of it. Everything. And yet, peasants have been granted the right to lease their land for 30 years. And you can buy a lease for a property in China for 70 years. You can't own the land in China. It's forbidden by the Constitution. Now, that still is public ownership, even though people buy and sell the leases for this land. Like a council in London. If you buy a council flat in London from the state, you also get a lease for 75 years or 100 years. And after that 100 years expired, the property, in theory at least, returns to the state. And so we have different forms of public ownership. You can also have cooperatives. Cooperatives are a semi-private public ownership form. They were advocated by Proudhon and others. The cooperative shops. And John Lewis is a cooperative, owned by the workers inside the workplace. Huawei was originally set up as a cooperative, or better said, a workers-owned company. And officially, it's still a workers-owned company. But actually, it's largely controlled by the state. In China, you also have limited liability companies and shareholding enterprises. Now, this led to a lot of confusion in the West, because the World Bank, the IMF, the big capitalist companies, they all said, oh, China's now stock market companies. Many of the, or better said, most companies on the stock market in China are state-owned companies. They allow you to buy shares, but the shares give you no control. They just give you a dividend on the return on profits. And these companies are state-owned because a holding company at the top owns the majority of shares in the company below, owns the majority below, majority below, majority below. And so there are many different forms of public ownership in the technical and legal sense.
Okay.
And yes, you're perfectly right that that does not mean control by the people, for the people, in any sense of the word.
Good.
I
Thank you,
agree.
thank you. Finally,
Except
finally.
this.
Yeah.
Except
Your answer.
this.
Yeah.
Except this.
This is like a fucking dead end.
The reason why the Communist Party controls the society in China is because the Communist Party, the very word means public ownership party. That's what it is.
Do you know what communism is?
And nearly everybody who works in a state-owned enterprise in China is a member of the Communist Party. Nearly everybody. About 80% of the people who work in state-owned enterprise in China are members of the Communist Party.
Okay, Heiko, explain to us what's the difference between communism and socialism. Do you know it?
I understand, but this is it relevant for
It
discussion?
shouldn't be
Yes,
called
absolutely
communist.
it's
No, wait.
relevant to this
First of all, it
discussion.
shouldn't be called communist party. It should be
Like,
called
like
socialist
China
party.
China
Because
is
it's
not communism. China is not.
Exactly.
Did I
China is
say
not
it was?
socialism.
Did I say it was?
No, but
Like,
it's called the
did I
communist
say
party.
about
Why is
it?
it called the communist
I'm
party?
talking about the internal dynamics of an economy based on the dominance
Yes.
of public ownership
But
as
is Chi-
opposed
is
to the
China better
internal
than America?
dynamics of an economy dominated by private ownership. I'm trying to clarify to you why these animals behave differently.
Who's made the most out?
Both animals
Who's
have
made the
4
most out of
legs.
Well,
Chinese-
because they're different
Both animals have tails.
I'm Chinese.
Both
right?
animals have fur. One goes meow, or one goes ah, and has different characteristics. They can, however, be quite different to each other. One could be a Pekingese sausage dog, another can be a wolf, and yet they are the same species.
Sure.
But when you approach them, they behave, they have certain characteristics, both genetically and in their behavior, which makes a Pekingese dog identifiable as a canine in the same way as a wolf is.
Okay, good
And
comparison.
so
good
too
comparison.
with a pussy cat, whether it be a Siamese cat or whether it be a lion, they have similarities which identify them as feline.
Yes.
I am identifying the different characteristics of the different socio-economic systems which dominate the world today and are represented by China and America. That's why I'm identifying, because if you don't know that one is a cat and one is a dog, you can't tell how they're going to behave.
But the cat and the dog are not felines, though. They're not both felines.
Chinese system and the Indian system, because when I've been to China, I've been to India, had a very low opinion of India, but they put a tremendous number of people into the middle class. That middle class is starting to matter. Also,
He doesn't like the middle class.
Got dirt roads. I mean, I've been there. They've got a fantastic underground tube system, far better than our system. So I don't see why you've got to always polarise between China and America.
I'm merely pointing out how the inner dynamics of the system, which sector of the economy dominates, public or private, shapes the entire character of the social system. That's why one system operates one way, another system operates another way. It's not a moral judgment, it's a scientific analysis of the internal dynamics of public versus private. Public being not some lauded entity that must be praised because it's public, but because it produces certain social dynamics behind it.
Thank you,
Just
Heiko.
the same as
Thank you.
as a
Yes.
state-owned school in Britain has internal dynamics to it which are different to a privately owned school.
Okay.
Even though we use the word public school for private
Yes.
school. Doesn't matter what the terminology for it is, it matters how it functions. And we know how it functions because we analyse its internal dynamics and contradictions. So let me just explain what that means for me politically, just quickly, bear with me. In America, the dynamics of social change will be towards a movement, a social movement by the working classes, generically, towards the creation of a society with greater and greater public ownership. That's why Bernie Sanders, to gain support, must say minimum wages, expand the healthcare service, expand education. It's advocating the increase in the size of the public sector and an increase in the position of the public sector within society. That's why Jeremy Corbyn in Britain advocates public ownership of the railways, public ownership of utilities, public ownership and investment, a state-owned bank to promote investment, because the public sector has a different dynamism and internal drive that makes it behave in a certain way to meet certain objectives that large sections of the labour ring classes support at different times. It can go up and down. But basically, that's why these socialist parties, like the Labour Party, exist. Right? Now, that dynamic is not the same in China. In China, you have a dictatorship.
No kidding.
Dictatorship controlled by the Communist Party. The Communist Party controls all the institutions of power, everything, from the children's organisation to the missions to Mars. All of them are controlled by Communist Party officials. Now, their claim to authority and their justification for power is that they serve the people and their objectives. They are claiming that what they do with public property is to the benefit of the population.
Of course.
Whether rightly or wrongly, that's their claim to fame and authority.
Yeah, but they are
Now,
private companies, according to
yes,
you.
I'm not disputing
So they
that.
have private property. Their high quarters are private property. So not all property in China is public.
No, I didn't say it was.
Yes, you did.
No, I said the benefit of China, the
You
advantage
said
of
all.
China. I didn't.
All of.
I
yeah,
said the
yeah,
largest
yeah, yeah, it's okay,
enterprises,
I'm
the
right.
driving force of the economy. Around 50% of the economy is privately owned. So I'm not disputing that at all. In fact, it could go up to 60 sometimes, and sometimes it's been nearly 70% of the economy. It's gone back down to about 50% in the last 5 years. Now, the key question is, what are the driving forces in the economy? If you want to shape the British economy, you can take over 500 coffee shops. You'll never shape the British economy. If you take over 4 banks, you can drive the whole economy in one direction or another. To disaster, perhaps, or to investment for the needs of the people. You can drive it in many different directions.
If you take over
After all,
Starbucks,
in
you will
2000
probably be able
What?
to. If you take over Starbucks, which is
Well,
a multinational company,
you won't do
which
anything.
has much greater sway
but
than
what?
any bank,
But what?
then
no
you will
better,
shape
it's no better
the
sway than
economy.
look. I'll finish on this because it was raised earlier on, and I hope I've done. Unless you've got some specific things you want to clarify.
Oh, I did.
Okay,
I'd
I've got
like
a couple
to
more, but then I'll just make this
go more
point.
in depth.
Last week, Mark Zuckerberg said he's going to release a new currency.
The robot.
Currency is going to go Libra. And it's going to be a blockchain currency, basically a mechanism of carrying out transactions autonomously, so independently, but as a record on the blockchain. Now, a blockchain technology or currency backed by a basket of the leading currencies. Now, one of the co-founders of Facebook went on to the Financial Times and published an article condemning it. Because what will happen? If this was actually to happen, that everybody used Facebook's currency and put their money into Facebook's currency, any economy would experience, any poorer economy, weaker economy will collapse. Because everybody, if you're not feel secure in Venezuela or Argentina or Guatemala or in Liberia or in Indonesia, where the rupiah might fluctuate more, where the economy is not so stable, you're going to put your currency into Libra, which is freely exchangeable. So in other words, only the most powerful economic countries, backed by them, which release the most powerful currencies, only their currencies will survive and be represented by this economy from Mark Zuckerberg. So the dynamics of a system determine how it operates. So why do I talk about China differently? Because I believe that the dynamics of change in China will be different to the dynamics in the West. And the dynamics of the change in China will tend towards, at least I hope so, and that's one of the dynamics which is possible, is when a revolutionary crisis emerges in China, there will be a democratic communist tendency emerge, which will be based on the idea that the working classes should administer the economy for the interests of the people themselves. That would then be democratic administration of public ownership. That's the idea of Marx, of communism and socialism. That, I believe, you can study the research, you can study the revolutions throughout the history of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and China. And you'll see in every single one of those revolutions, that was one of the most powerful tendencies within those revolutions. It dominated 1956 in Hungary, it dominated 1968 in Czechoslovakia, it dominated 1968 in Yugoslavia, and it was about maybe 30% of the attitude of the population in East Germany in 1989, maybe 30% in Czechoslovakia, maybe 40% in Romania in 1989. And so this tendency is how I see in those countries the move towards genuine communism and socialism. It has a different dynamic to under capitalism. That's why I distinguish, because only by knowing the internal dynamics of a system can you know how it will change. That's why I distinguish. It won't be, in China suddenly they say, oh, we all want free elections, and then free elections you've got multiple parties, and even if it did emerge like that, let's say tomorrow Xi Jinping turns around and says, okay, game's up, we can have free political parties, anyone can have a candidate, anyone can form a party, and we'll have elections on the 20th of July. Now, what will happen? Political tendencies will diverge. There'll be nationalist movements, there'll be liberal parties, there'll be democratic parties. I remember in East Germany, there was a beer drinking party. There was a sex party. All these parties were created. But come down to the time they divided between a few factions. Those who supported the democratization of public ownership and those who wanted capitalism restored. This was the division. That's what happened in East Germany. That's what would happen in China. The likelihood is, however, that if there was a Democratic Communist Party advocating a more egalitarian society with more democratic control of the economy, they would be elected overwhelmingly. They would get mass support within the population. That's why my contention about China is its internal dynamics are different to capitalism. If you stand in America, however, in Britain or America, you can have a political party declares it wants public ownership to dominate the economy. But when that political party gains a significant amount of influence, the whole establishment mobilizes against it to try and stop that party from ever winning an election. And if they do win an election, then they organize the armed forces whenever necessary to overthrow that government. I can give you many examples. Guatemala in 1953.
Before that, something else.
Venezuela in modern times. Chile in 1970. These processes, when a democratically elected socialist government comes to power, the capitalist establishment mobilized to overthrow it. So there is a different dynamic within capitalism and within the planned economies. That was the central basis of my argument.
The democratically elected kind of makes me laugh a little bit because it reminds me a lot of the referendum in Crimea, where the Russian army invaded before the democratic democratic election.
Yeah, but with reference to what was I referring? What democratic election?
Heiko, it's not a democratic election if you get shot in the head for voting for the wrong person.
Yeah, but don't
it's
forget,
not.
What did I just say?
It's not public property.
No, but
Heiko,
if Corbyn is elected,
wait.
and the generals overthrow the government, is that democracy?
Heiko, come on. Heiko. There are many.
The generals have said, or one general, serving general in the British Army, said
this
in
is a monarchy.
2015
this is a monarchy.
that if Corbyn is elected, they would have to overthrow the government.
What time of this is a monarchy did you not? What
democracy?
What part of this is a monarchy did you not understand? It's mostly a monarchy. The Queen does whatever she wants.
No, I don't agree with you. That's not true.
Yes, she does.
It doesn't matter.
She doesn't do anything because there'll be trouble if she does what she wants. Sorry?
I think we've had enough. I've been speaking for a while.
Oh, Heiko, come on.
It's not just a debate with you. I've been speaking for a while. I think we're not going anywhere specific with this. Therefore,
yeah, of course
but I think we have
I've been trying to ask
if you look at what we discussed, we've gone into a great deal of detail about the distinction between systems.
Well, now we
That's
got to the
what I was trying
actual
to do.
questions
No, now
about
to your
public
actual
property.
question.
Yeah, and you still didn't answer it, Heiko.
What didn't I answer?
Public property is
one
some
more
place.
attempt.
Okay, one more attempt. Last attempt from me too. Public property here, at least in the West, and in overall civilized countries where there's not dictatorship as the ruling, in charge. Public property is a place where you can go, you can speak freely with other people, you can do many different things there. If you're not attacking the personal freedom of other people, you can do all of that stuff. You can just go do a speech wherever you want in a park.
Property.
Yes.
I mean, look, local governments.
No, wait. In China, if you go to a place like this, to a park in China, and you start talking trash about the government, that's it.
I said that earlier.
That's it.
on.
Yeah, you said it's not the same public property, but it kind of defeats the purpose of calling it public property because it's not public
That's your
property.
view, but it operates. My point was that public property in the commanding heights of the economy, I'll just repeat it again because we are going in a circle, has a different dynamic to capitalism at the heart of the economy. That's what I'm saying.
Because that's
So
not
under
public property, man. It's
Under-
still property of the
Under
state.
capitalism, you can elect a socialist government, but then suddenly this democracy begins to wither away because capitalism feels threatened by the dominance of public ownership. And so if public ownership becomes dominant, they will mobilize whatever resources there are to overthrow the government, by hook or by crook. There are many, many examples
Why
of that.
would they want to overthrow the government?
Because
They
it
live
no
good
longer
lives.
represents their interests.
No one represents it. Okay, go get the
We've been speaking a while. Thanks very much. See you later.
Anyway, see you later. Where'd you get the hat?
How's you, all right? Pretty good?
24 pounds for a crummy hat. Come on, kid. You shouldn't waste your
It's
time.
so good.
From your Come, man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
Physical harm is important, but emotional harm is no. Emotional harm, I do not give two shits if you go home and cry your eyes out in your bed. Because that is on you. That is on you to sort yourself out with your psychology. If some moron like me saying some crass thing is going to disturb you so much that you will psychologically be